In the spring of 1901, a suffocating heat settled early over St. Landry Parish, Louisiana. The swamps bloomed with decay, the cypress trees wept slow droplets from their hanging moss, and the air felt charged, like a thunderstorm that never came. That was the year the LaRue sisters, Madeline, Odette, and Beatrice, began hearing the whispers. Locals would later say it began with the frogs. Hundreds of them, all dead, floating belly up in the irrigation canals that cut through the sugarcane fields. Then came the dogs, packs of strays roaming the edges of the LaRue property, circling the house but never barking, their heads tilted as if listening to something only they could hear. Then, the girls stopped speaking. The LaRue family lived on a 200-acre estate near Bayou Teche. Their home, a once beautiful Creole plantation house, had been rebuilt after the Civil War by their father, Etienne LaRue, a banker turned spiritualist who'd lost his wife to yellow fever in 1894. Since then, he had raised his daughters alone, keeping them secluded from town life. Their education was handled by a private tutor from New Orleans, their spiritual instruction by Etienne himself. The LaRues didn't attend church. That fact alone had always made townspeople uneasy. By March, the girls, ages 17, 15, and 13, had begun writing in their journals using symbols no one could translate. They painted in perfect symmetry with mirrored strokes, and when they spoke again, it was always in unison. Even more disturbing, they began calling each other by names that weren't theirs, ancient names, heavy with consonants and unfamiliar cadence. Etienne claimed it was a breakthrough, proof that they had opened the channel, but the family's housekeeper, a woman named Viola, who had worked for them for nearly 20 years, fled the home one night barefoot and bleeding, screaming that the girls' eyes had turned black as swamp water, and that something was inside them now. She never returned. 2 weeks later, the local priest, Father Gabriel Leclerc, was summoned to the house for what was only described in the church ledger as a spiritual emergency. He arrived with 2 deacons and a traveling Jesuit from Chicago known for handling matters of possession. They stayed inside the LaRue house for 3 nights. On the 4th morning, the Jesuit was gone. Father Gabriel gave no explanation. He only said Mass that week wearing his vestments inside out, his hands visibly shaking as he turned the pages of the Missal. Rumors spread quickly, of markings carved into the floorboards, of hymns sung backward during the girls' evening prayers, of 3 voices speaking in one body, always in a language no one dared record. To this day, the Catholic Diocese of Lafayette lists no record of the LaRue sisters, nor any visit by a Jesuit priest in 1901. But what really happened in that house? And why did the church seal the records? In the spring of 1901, when an unusually early heat wave scorched the sugarcane fields of St. Landry Parish, Louisiana, 3 sisters named LaRue began to exhibit behaviors that defied all spiritual and medical explanation. Their transformation was so profound and so grotesque that 2 priests resigned from their positions, a 3rd vanished without a trace, and the Archdiocese of Lafayette quietly erased all records connected to the family. What began as spiritual awakening, their father claimed, soon became something far more disturbing, a possession so complete, so absolute, that neighbors swore the girls were no longer speaking for themselves. They weren't even speaking in human voices anymore. By midsummer, the family's housekeeper fled barefoot in the night, shrieking that they weren't girls no more. Parishioners reported seeing the sisters walking into the bayou fully clothed, only to return hours later completely dry. They began to speak in perfect unison, chanting prayers no one recognized. Their skin grew pale and cool to the touch, even during the hottest hours of the day, and their eyes, once hazel like their mother's, darkened until they were the color of cypress water after a rainstorm. The church refused to speak on the matter. The only surviving document from the parish ledger contains 9 words, written in Latin and underlined twice in red ink. Fiat silentium, nolite loqui de tribus. Let there be silence. Speak not of the 3. Tonight, after 124 years of silence, we're going to uncover what really happened to Madeleine, Odette, and Beatrice LaRue, and why the Vatican may have had every reason to suppress the truth. Before we continue, I need to ask you something important. This story is not for the faint of heart. If you're the kind of person who needs things explained, rationalized, or softened, this video isn't for you. But if you're brave enough to stare into the dark corners that even faith avoids, subscribe now and tell me in the comments, what state or country are you watching from? Because tonight, we're going back to a time and place where belief was survival and silence was the only protection. Let's return to the heat-heavy swamps of southern Louisiana, where something unholy found its voice in a farmhouse chapel, and 3 young girls answered it. The LaRue family home stood on the edge of Bayou Teche, a once grand plantation house surrounded by sugarcane fields and cypress trees draped in moss. It was a quiet place, too quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed in on you, like the air just before a thunderclap. The house had no neighbors in sight, just water, woods, and sky. The nearest chapel was 5 miles east in Opelousas, but the LaRues didn't go to church. They had built their own. A 30-foot limestone chapel stood at the far corner of their property, constructed by hand by Etienne LaRue and his daughters. It had no cross, no altar, and no pews. Only a single wooden chair placed in the center of a salt ring that had been carved directly into the floor. The windows had no glass, just slits that let the wind whistle through like a flute. There were no hymnals, only leather-bound journals filled with strange markings. Josiah LeBlanc, a mason who helped lay the foundation, would later say the blueprints changed halfway through the build. Etienne stopped using the plans and began carving measurements into the dirt with his boot. He said the numbers came to him in dreams. LeBlanc recalled, said they were sacred. By June, the sisters no longer responded to their birth names. They called each other by other titles, Asmareth, Nihla, and Tsuriel. Their voices were still soft, still girlish, but there was a rhythm to them, a cadence that didn't match southern speech patterns. Locals said it sounded like they were singing, like they were always just on the edge of a chant. The first outsider to witness the change was Viola, their longtime housekeeper. On June 3rd, she returned early from market and heard what she thought was laughter coming from the chapel. But when she opened the door, she found all 3 girls standing in the center of the salt ring, hands clasped, eyes rolled back, and mouths moving in perfect unison. Viola said the air inside was icy cold, though the sun outside was over 90 degrees. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. And when the girls looked at her, their eyes were completely black. No iris, no whites, just black. Like water with no bottom, she told Father Gabriel later. She ran barefoot all the way to the church, her feet bloodied by the gravel path. She never stepped foot on the LaRue property again. The next morning, Etienne sent a sealed letter to the Archdiocese. It arrived without a return address, and the priest who opened it went pale before locking it away in a drawer labeled Private Matters. What did the letter contain? And why was the response not to intervene, but to observe in silence? 3 days after the letter reached Lafayette, a black carriage arrived at the LaRue estate just before sunset. The driver wore no clerical garments, no collar, only a plain black coat and dark gloves, despite the sweltering heat. Inside the carriage sat a man the church never publicly acknowledged, Father Augustin Marot, a Jesuit dispatched from Chicago, a man known for his role in quiet cases, where doctrine met phenomena too unsettling to define. He was not listed in any parish records. He carried no Bible, only a small case, bound in human hide leather and etched with the Latin phrase, Malum non extirps, sed cohibs. You do not destroy evil, you contain it. That evening, Father Gabriel Leclerc and 2 deacons from Opelousas arrived to assist. All 4 men entered the LaRue home just after 7:00 p.m. Then they were not seen again for 3 nights. Neighbors said the house stayed dark the entire time, though flickers of unnatural blue light pulsed from the chapel during each dusk and dawn. One farmer claimed he saw shadows moving in the upstairs window, shadows that didn't match the number of people known to be inside. On the morning of the 4th day, only Father Gabriel emerged. He looked older, his black hair streaked with gray, his gait unsteady, as if he'd walked through something far heavier than time. He said nothing to the deacons' families, nothing to the congregation. The next Sunday, he wore his vestments inside out and refused to speak any words of scripture aloud. When asked about Father Moreau, he only muttered, "He's been reclaimed." The church said Father Moreau had returned to Chicago, but no train station agent in the state recalled anyone matching his description boarding a departure. His last known address was cleared of all belongings within 24 hours, and the 2 deacons who entered with him resigned their posts, refusing to discuss what they'd seen. Inside the LaRue house, things grew stranger. Madeleine, Odette, and Beatrice stopped eating altogether. Their father claimed they no longer needed food, that their spirits were being sustained by revelation. But their bodies did not wither. If anything, they grew stronger. They began reciting entire books of the Old Testament from memory, backwards. Their voices became layered, harmonic, vibrating with unnatural resonance that made listeners dizzy or violently ill. A traveling Bible salesman who overheard them praying vomited blood for 2 days. His final words before being committed to an asylum in Baton Rouge were, "They're singing things older than language." No one in the parish dared visit the LaRue home again, and no one dared say the sisters' names out loud. What had they become? And what had they allowed in? By the end of July 1901, the LaRue sisters were no longer seen in daylight. Etienne told the few remaining laborers on his land that the girls had entered seclusion for spiritual fasting. But the truth was harder to explain. Several field hands reported hearing chanting coming from the well behind the chapel, at night, always at night. Voices that didn't belong to the sisters or to anyone human. The well had been hand-dug by Etienne and a team of Creole workers back in 1895. 40 feet deep and lined with limestone, it had always provided clean, cold water. But sometime that summer, the water turned thick and silty. Animals refused to drink from it, and each morning, new symbols appeared etched into the stones just above the surface, marks that no local mason, no priest, no linguist could translate. Then came the incident with the rats. One Sunday morning in August, a small congregation gathered at the Opelousas church, led by a young deacon filling in for Father Gabriel, who had not spoken in public in weeks. As the opening hymn began, dozens of rats flooded into the chapel through the front doors, not scurrying, marching, in formation. They climbed the pulpit, lined the altar, and sat facing the pews as if waiting for a sermon. The congregation fled screaming. When the bishop later questioned Father Gabriel about it, he whispered, they were delivering a warning, and it came from the LaRue land. Back at the estate, Etienne LaRue stopped leaving his home altogether. He boarded the windows of the chapel, padlocked the front gate, and burned several of his late wife's possessions in a ritual fire near the bayou. He said she had returned in visions, not as herself, but as a messenger, warning him that something had gone wrong with the ritual they had begun together years ago. That's when the letters began. Several townspeople received handwritten notes, folded neatly and sealed with red wax bearing no emblem. The writing was precise, flowing, almost mechanical. The notes contained biblical verses, but altered. Small changes, twisted meanings, scripture turned back on itself like a snake devouring its own tail. Verses from Revelation where Jesus' name was replaced with another. And lo, Asmareth shall open the seventh seal, and the silence in heaven shall end. No one admitted to reading an entire letter aloud, but those who tried found their mouths filled with the taste of ash and their dreams haunted by the sound of wet footsteps outside their door. At the parish office, an unnamed file was added to the confidential drawer. Its label read, "The False Trinity, Status Uncontainable." What did Etienne awaken? And were the girls still his daughters? By late August, the rest of St. Landry Parish was suffering from the worst drought in over 20 years. Crops withered to brittle stalks, wells dried to cracked stone, and livestock collapsed under the unrelenting heat. But not on the LaRue land. There, the cane fields stood tall, green, lush, and swaying gently under windless skies. When asked how they managed to keep their fields thriving, Etienne simply smiled and said, "The soil knows who tends it." But one former farmhand claimed to have seen something else, something no one believed at first. He said that at night, under the light of a gibbous moon, the sisters walked the edges of the field barefoot, singing in low, rhythmic tones. Wherever they stepped, the cane seemed to straighten. Wherever they sang, the leaves unfolded. But the plants weren't right. Their color was too deep, almost black in low light. The leaves made no rustling noise, and when a parish inspector tried to cut a sample for testing, the stalk bled. A thick, dark sap oozed out, staining his hands for days. The inspector returned to town and filed a report. It was never found. The town began whispering of a devil's harvest. Old women crossed themselves when the wind shifted from the east. Children were told never to walk within sight of the LaRue fields. Even animals seemed to avoid the property line, except for the crows. Hundreds of them. They gathered on the chapel roof, lining every inch of the limestone crossbeam, watching the fields like sentinels. One merchant who passed by on his way to Baton Rouge claimed the birds followed his cart for miles, never flapping their wings, just gliding silently above him until he crossed the river. And still, the sisters were not seen. Etienne did all the trading, arriving in town with fresh sugar cane, sweet beyond anything buyers had ever tasted. He traded in silence, with a smile that no longer reached his eyes. His once broad shoulders were hunched, and his fingernails stained black beneath the cuticles. When someone dared ask about his daughters, he replied, "They are closer to heaven now, much closer than you or I." In September, 2 children went missing. Last seen playing near the boundary fence of the LaRue property. Their shoes were found the next morning, placed neatly at the chapel door. No footprints, no signs of struggle, just silence, and the sound of humming from the well. What price was the land demanding, and who had agreed to pay it? On the night of September 28, 1901, a lunar eclipse turned the sky over Louisiana the color of dried blood. Superstitious farmers locked their doors, mothers clutched rosaries in the dark, and inside the LaRue chapel, something stirred. At exactly 11:11 p.m., a light was seen shining from the chapel roof. No flame, no lantern, but a pulsating glow. deep red and throbbing like a heartbeat. 3 neighbors confirmed the glow. All 3 would later refuse to describe it in detail. One, a man named Lionel Thibodeau, said only, "It looked like something was trying to come through the sky." That same night, Etienne was seen walking the perimeter of the field barefoot, whispering to the cane as if it could understand. A traveling preacher passing through town claimed he heard music in the air, low, droning, like a pipe organ played underwater, and underneath the tones, a voice, singular, feminine, not loud, but enormous. He turned back to Opelousas that instant, and within 2 days boarded a train north. He left behind his Bible. It was found warped and damp with something oily. At dawn, the townspeople who had dared to gather near the LaRue property saw something had changed. The chapel was no longer made of stone or wood. It had become something else entirely, impossible to describe. The structure shimmered faintly, bending the air around it. A cotton picker described it as a building made of heat. The walls no longer cast clear shadows. The door was open, but nothing lay inside. The altar was gone. In its place, a circle had been carved into the ground, 10 feet wide and marked with concentric rings, each lined with animal bones, all facing inward. No human footprints led in or out. That afternoon, Etienne was found standing waist-deep in the bayou, arms lifted to the sky, speaking to something no one could see. When sheriff's deputies approached, he turned to them and said, "The girls are beyond you now. They no longer require bodies." He was arrested without resistance and taken to the jailhouse in Lafayette. He didn't eat, didn't drink, only murmured to the walls in a dead dialect no linguist could identify. When shown a Bible, he tore out the book of Revelation and swallowed it page by page until his throat bled. He died on the 7th day of confinement. But what was most disturbing wasn't his death. It was what the coroner found beneath his skin. Tiny black threads woven into the muscle like roots. What had been growing in him, and was it still growing somewhere else? After Etienne's death, a silence fell over the LaRue estate. Not just quiet, silence. No insects, no birdsong, no wind rustling through the cane. It was as if sound itself avoided the place. Local children dared each other to run along the property fence, but none lasted more than a few seconds. "It felt like something was listening," one boy said. "Like if you made a sound, it would answer." Then the sightings began. Madeline, Odette, and Beatrice were seen again, but they were not the same. A farmer returning late from town claimed he saw 3 figures walking across the sugarcane rows. White dresses, long hair, moving slowly. But there were no footsteps. Their hems hovered inches above the soil. No arms swung at their sides. No breathing. Just smooth, mechanical motion, gliding in perfect unison across the fields. He followed them to the edge of the chapel, where they vanished. Not behind the door, but into the wall, as if the stone had swallowed them. The sheriff dismissed the claim, until 3 more witnesses came forward the same week, all describing the same figures. All 3 broke into nosebleeds while retelling the story. Father Gabriel, who had remained silent for weeks, finally spoke again. He summoned the diocesan archivist and requested the 5th catechy, a forbidden theological manuscript rumored to contain knowledge of divine imitations and entities that mimic the holy for malevolent purposes. The archivist brought it reluctantly. What he found in its pages sent him into seizures. The book described the chorus of the hallowed, a trio of vessels used to channel celestial frequencies not meant for human ears. It warned of sisters who speak with one voice, and feet that leave no imprint. The conditions matched the LaRue sisters exactly. Father Gabriel declared the land desecrated. He ordered the chapel excommunicated and requested an official exorcism of the estate. But the Vatican denied his petition. The letter came stamped not with a seal, but with a black wax symbol, unidentified. The Latin read, Non tangere, advenae manent. Do not interfere. The visitors remain. Within a week, Father Gabriel went missing. His last written note was discovered in the confessional. I prayed to hear God's voice, but I heard theirs instead. His cassock was found folded on the edge of the LaRue well. The water had gone completely black. Were the girls ever meant to survive, or had they become something else entirely? By October, no one dared go near the LaRue estate. Not priests, not lawmen, not even thieves. But one man did. His name was Henri Valois, a French folklorist and occult scholar passing through Louisiana to study colonial-era superstitions. When he heard whispers of 3 sisters who sang in sleep, he requested access to the LaRue home. No one gave it. So he went in alone. He left a journal behind. What follows is transcribed from its final entries. I entered through the back, window left open. Smelled like burned sugar and cedar. The floor creaked, but the echoes weren't right. I stepped once and heard 3 replies, like the house remembered walking. Henri explored the home room by room, describing it as frozen in time. The girls' rooms were still tidy, beds made, Bibles placed neatly, but their mirrors had been covered, some shattered. In Madeline's room, he found a handwritten page folded into a book of Psalms. It read, "The body is a cup. We were made to pour." In the chapel, things were worse. The circle on the floor remained, but now there were carvings. Thousands of tiny etchings, letters, symbols, numbers spiraling inward until they met at a single blackened point. Henri said standing in the chapel felt like falling, even when still. Then he heard it. Beneath the floorboards, a harmony. 3 voices, humming, not loud, but all-consuming. The sound entered his teeth, his bones, his breath. He couldn't move, couldn't think, just listen. He said it felt like prayer, but wrong. A prayer from something that never knelt, he wrote. Then the humming stopped, and something whispered his name. Not once, 3 times, each from a different direction. Henri fled the house and collapsed in the cane fields. Locals found him hours later, shaking, eyes wide, mouth muttering syllables they couldn't understand. He was institutionalized in New Orleans the next day. But not before scrawling one last sentence into his journal with a shard of mirror. They do not need to be seen, only heard. After that night, the LaRue house changed again. Visitors said it breathed. Windows fogged from within, candles placed near the porch extinguished themselves. Photographs taken on the land came out warped, blurred with streaks of red. The property was eventually condemned, but not by the government. By the Archdiocese, who classified the location as nullum sacramentum. No sacrament may be performed here, not even burial. What still sings beneath the floor? And why do the church's records end here? In 1946, 45 years after the LaRue incident, the land was finally listed for sale. The estate, overgrown and crumbling, had been untouched for decades. But a Houston businessman named Charles Dunning saw opportunity. Sugar prices were climbing. He made an offer the same day he visited the property. He did not spend the night. Charles brought his surveyor, his land agent, and a photographer to document the property. They arrived just before noon. The heat was oppressive, but that wasn't unusual for late summer in southern Louisiana. What was unusual was the condition of the house. Despite being abandoned for nearly half a century, the structure stood perfectly intact. No termite damage, no sagging beams. The cane fields had regrown around it, unnaturally uniform, like rows planted by a hand that had never forgotten. Charles entered the home first. His notes described the air inside as cooler than it should have been. He made his way through the parlor, noting the preserved furniture, the religious symbols, the chapel key still hanging by the kitchen door. That's when the humming started. Not loud, barely audible, but low enough to vibrate the teeth. The surveyor, a man named Glenn Waller, stepped into the chapel ahead of Charles. He crossed the threshold, took 3 steps inside, and immediately turned around, face pale, eyes unfocused. He whispered, "Something's still in there." He never said what. The photographer raised his camera to capture the altar, but the lens cracked. Not shattered, cracked from the inside. Charles, shaken but determined, returned to the porch to write down his observations. That's when he saw them. 3 young girls standing at the edge of the cane, barefoot, still, watching. He called out. They did not answer. He walked 5 steps toward them, blinked. They were gone. The men left the property without speaking. The photographs taken came out blank. Not black, not overexposed, just blank. The sale was canceled the next day. Charles never returned to Louisiana. In an interview 5 years later, he was asked why he backed out. He paused and said, "You ever hear something so sacred it turns your blood cold?" He died in 1957 from an aneurysm. An autopsy revealed his inner ear had collapsed, shattered from within, as if ruptured by a sound no one else heard. Since then, no buyer has approached the land. The estate remains unsold, untouched, waiting. Who are the girls still standing in the cane? And what would happen if someone finally called them by name? In 1999, an amateur paranormal investigator named Daniel Kearns visited the LaRue property under the cover of night. He had no official clearance, no team, just a camera, a cassette recorder, and a Bible. He was never seen again. But his tape recorder was found days later by a group of teens who dared to trespass onto the property on Halloween night. The device sat just outside the chapel's doorway, half buried in sugarcane mud, still recording. The cassette was nearly full, 60 minutes of wind, static, and something else. Near the 42-minute mark, a sound emerges. 3 tones, high, low, high again. Then a voice, fragile, genderless, whispering, "I am the gap between your prayers," followed by silence. Then the unmistakable sound of barefoot footsteps moving closer and closer, until the tape was with a sharp pop. The Bible Daniel brought with him was found inside the chapel, propped open on a small stone outcropping that had not been there in previous reports. The pages were turned to 1 Samuel 28, the story of Saul and the witch of Endor. One line was underlined 3 times in black ink. "And when the woman saw Samuel, she cried with a loud voice, 'Why hast thou deceived me?'" Tucked inside the page was a final note, handwritten, Daniel's signature at the bottom. "They are not spirits. They are echoes of something older, something beneath belief. The church tried to silence it, but silence is what feeds them." The local diocese was notified but refused to retrieve the Bible or the tape. Instead, a wooden sign was erected just outside the old LaRue gate. It reads, "Private property. Entry forbidden by order of the Archdiocese." Below, smaller letters burned into the wood. No sacraments beyond this point. The fields still grow, the house still stands, and some nights, locals say they hear humming carried on the wind, always in threes, always from the direction of the chapel. And sometimes, if you're very quiet, they say the voices speak your name. One, then another, then a third. But what happens if you answer? And who or what do you become?